Okay, hello and good afternoon to everybody. A warm welcome to webinar 4 in the Talking Business During Crisis series. My name is Aviva Burson and I'm very pleased to host today's conversation on how organisations can survive now and thrive later. This is part of a two-part series and today's topic is on the role of purpose for organisations. We'll be having the second part of this series the same time next Thursday, focusing on the leadership factor. So please join us then as well. Before we kick off the conversation, I'd just like to start off with a bit of housekeeping and sharing the flow of today's conversation. So the actual conversation, the heart of the discussion between the faculty members that I'll introduce shortly will run for about 40 minutes on a range of topics relating to organisations and purpose. And then we'll be inviting you to ask or share your questions. But please don't wait until the end. If a question comes up, you can add it in the Q&A section. And if you are seeing a question that you like and you'd like answered, you can give it the thumbs up and that upvotes it and puts it to the top of the priority list. The conversation, today's webinar will run for an hour and we'll get you off and ready for the rest of your day from 1:30. So we'll spend about 40 minutes having conversation and then the remaining 20 at the end to answer your questions through the Q&A. We'll also send you a link to a survey at the end of the conversation just to get your feedback so we can keep improving our webinars and make sure they really do target that you're interested to be hearing about. I'll take a moment now just to introduce you to our speakers today and then let them introduce themselves. So we have with us Jeff Martin, the Professor of Strategy at Melbourne Business School, and Amanda Sinclair, a Professorial Fellow also at Melbourne Business School, and Glenn Hedka, who is the MBS Foundation Chair of Sustainability in Business and another Professor of Strategy at Melbourne Business School. My name, as I've said, is Aviva Burson. I am the lead learning consultant in the Organisational Learning Group at Melbourne Business School and very excited to be the host of today's conversation. So before we get into the heart of the discussion today on organisation and purpose, I might ask each of you to share in high-level terms what it is that you'll be talking about today and why does this matter to you. So we might start with Jeff. And you are on mute, Jeff.
Got me now?
Loud and clear, Jeff.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. Yeah, welcome back. So purpose is used interchangeably with the word mission. And the tool for strategic communication, which conveys two things, clarity and motivation. So it provides clarity about the stakeholders that are most important to this organisation and our value proposition to those stakeholders. So in that statement of purpose or mission, whichever language you'd like to use, try and convey that very clearly. So who are the stakeholders that this organisation is here to serve? And this really gets into your reason for being. So what would the world lose if this organisation didn't exist? So within that, you've got the clarity. So clarity of what stakeholders we're here to serve and our value proposition to them. But also you've got an opportunity to motivate your staff by making it clear that it's not just about maintaining water infrastructure or providing logistics services. So we provide logistics services to ensure that there's a gateway to the global economy for the local manufacturers, or we provide water infrastructure or electricity infrastructure to provide the breath of life to the people that matter. So what we're trying to do with purpose is do the both, create that emotive hook that makes it clear to people that there's a reason why this organisation exists beyond just the service and just the product we provide. It's a systemically important organisation. Now, what we're trying to do there, so you're trying to provide clarity and motivate, and the beginning of a cascade of our strategy. So once you've got that purpose, that's your starting point to then lay out a set of objectives that reflect whether we've delivered on purpose, and then an action plan flows from there. So as you're building a strategy or trying to take a leadership team or an organisation on a journey, on a strategic journey, we start with purpose.
Thanks, Jeff. I look forward to hearing more about that over the course of the conversation. I might ask Amanda to introduce herself and what you'll be talking about today.
Thanks, Aviva, and hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. So my interest in purpose really comes from my own background in leadership, and For me, purpose is a living statement about what matters to the members of an organisation and the stakeholders and the communities surrounding that organisation. And for me, a purpose, well, the value of a purpose is only ever as good as the process by which that purpose has been arrived at, the processes by which it is lived and communicated, reviewed. So I guess, my own experience is that I've seen many purposes whereby, there've been a kind of a statement that's come down from on high from the senior management team, but haven't been really owned by the members of the organisation and the communities and clients it serves. So I think that there's always a really important balance to make sure that purpose is really lived and reviewed and adapted to the changing conditions. And look, I think that that's why this topic is so important at the moment, because I think we should be looking again at our purpose, with not only COVID, but now the Black Lives Matter issues that are percolating around the world. As organisations, as people interested in leading with purpose, we need to be making sure our purpose is relevant to what matters in today's world. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of those ideas with my colleagues too, and with the audience.
Thanks, Amanda. And last but not least, Glenn, please let us know what you'll be talking about today.
Thank you very much, Aviva, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. So I'm a strategy professor by background who's spent about a decade working on sustainability. And that means I've been working with a lot of companies that have been trying to expand their purpose. And to Amanda's point, we're seeing a need to do that for companies, again, who are looking at maybe more expansive purpose than they've had before. And that can be very powerful, but from our own experience, from research I've been doing, from work I do with companies, and we'll talk more about this later, there's some real challenges in that more expansive purpose that can sneak up on you. And so that's one of the things I hope we can talk about. And it's also clearly the case that an event like COVID is a stress test for our purposes. Do we really execute it at the toughest times? And that's going to reveal bumps and warts and opportunities. And so this is a great chance for companies to revisit, revise, and re-energize their purposes. And I'd also say that a lot of this comes from my own experience. My mom and her partner owned a small grocery store in a little farming community. And this is the case with many small businesses and large businesses. It wasn't just about keeping us fed. It was about contributing to the community we were part of. And so I think having lived that and seen that up close is part of what motivates my sense that this is a really important discussion to have, particularly at times like now.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And it's always nice to hear the genesis of what brought people like yourself here to talk about topics like this. And in a post-COVID or COVID world, it's more timely now than ever before, I think, to be re-examining these things. So on that topic, thinking about purpose and organisations, Jeff, I might throw open to you with the first question and ask you to define to us what it is you refer to when you talk about purpose. What does that mean? And I know you've consulted to a lot of organisations and worked with them on defining their purpose. So let's open up with the definition.
Yep. So it's a communication of stakeholders that matter and your value proposition to those stakeholders, but also why is this organisation important in the broader scheme of things? So what's going to come out here is a really clear revelation of your values. So one old guy I've worked with for a long time in the middle of New South Wales, that organisation exists, and he keeps reminding me of this because his grandfather started it to employ people in the Mudgee region during the Great Depression. And so ever since, the purpose of that organisation has been to employ people and for the economic prosperity of that region. So straight away, that gives me a strong sense of what his value proposition could be to customers. It also gives me a strong sense of where he can't play. So if his factories are going to be in that region, there's some markets where he would never compete on a cost basis. So once I get a sense of who he is, and this is really, it's very evident in family businesses, you're trying to get a sense of who they are, what's important to them. So so purpose is going to reveal values, as in what is most important to this organisation. You know, what actually drives you. And when push comes to shove, and there's tension between one potential outcome or stakeholder outcome versus another, where do you lean on that? So just to give you another example there. So if you look at the missions of Coles and Woolies, so Coles speaks very directly to shareholder value, and Woolies talks very directly to the customer experience. And so you're getting a sense of how they make sense of the world, as in who they put a number one next to in their stakeholder ecosystem. And my observation here is that the predictor of performance isn't who you put a number one next to. It's understanding that there's a very delicate ecosystem here, and we need to take care of the whole. So if you think about the experience with the banks, so they pushed too hard with shareholder returns for a long time. And there was a point there where one of our prime ministers had said to Commonwealth Bank, 14% return on equity is too high. Can you wind that back? And so they didn't, and they got a Royal Commission. And so their purpose, regardless of what was happening more broadly in the organisation, the behaviours and certainly the incentives were all set up for the shareholder. So we're trying to work out what actually drives behaviours, incentives, and the big decisions about, you know, where do we, so I've got 100 million a year as a bank to spend on IT. I'll spend 95 of that on sales systems and 5 on regulatory systems, for instance. Now that's all been revisited on the back of Hayne. But what's really interesting as a result of what's happened with COVID is you've seen a repurposing of the banks, and the banks have been fighting to get that social license back because of the fact that they're saying, well, we're here for customers. And you see that as well with supermarkets during that period. So Coles might say, so their published mission is directing us at the shareholder. But you're seeing in the press when they're interviewing staff members in the various parts of the Coles network, and they're so proud of what they're doing to support the community during this period. So it's a really clear example of repurposing. Now that hasn't happened through a formal process of saying, oh, let's revisit our mission or purpose. It's happened organically through the organisation. So the onus is on the leaders, I think, to recognise that people are gaining energy, they're gaining motivation in their day-to-day tasks because they see that their day-to-day role is incredibly important to the people around them, whether it be that banker understanding that I've got to try and cut people some slack to get them through this period, or the person putting the toilet paper on the shelves at Coles, and the other stuff that really matters, like food. So that individual now senses that there's a higher purpose, there's a really important reason why their organisation exists. And that's a great part about a crisis. During a crisis, we've got to try and put our purpose on a wall. Now, if that's a purpose that hasn't motivated us in the past, maybe it's an opportunity to try and do this organically and say, well, hang on, let's stop and think about what our purpose actually is. But if it's one that's very clearly directed at, and this is what we're doing for society, this is what we're doing for economy, well, that's when you want to pin it on the wall. And sometimes purpose needs to be accompanied by a set of values. And so very often I'm putting a purpose and the set of values on the wall and saying, how do we respond to this crisis?
Thanks, Jeff. And as you were speaking, I was drawn to Glenn's area of work with sustainability, and wondering what is the connection between purpose and perhaps repurposing the organisation's focus in a post-COVID world?
It's a really tough challenge. And as Jeff pointed out, much of this is coming from below. This is coming from people's experience. And there's a real challenge here. And it's a balancing and it's a making things real. So we have some research we were doing where we looked at how much language there was about sustainability in companies' mission statements. And one of the things that we anecdotally, and with some research behind it, believe that sustainability and other pro-social parts of a purpose generates is a sense of pride in employees. And that helps with recruitment, it helps with retention, it encourages people to give extra effort. But we found this extra challenge. It can cause confusion because most companies, for-profit organizations, are coming from a point of, I know I'm supposed to make money. And now my management keeps talking about helping the community and being more sustainable. Well, I'm at the pointy end of the stick. Do I choose the cheaper supplier, or do I choose the supplier who's more environmentally sustainable? And what we found is that when the language was not followed up with concrete action, is it part of evaluation? Is training made available? Is it tracked at the same level and specificity and seriousness as other things? Then it causes a lot of confusion. Whereas if an employee sees both management language, but also management investment of time, of finance, of organization, backing a broader purpose, that helps resolve that clarity. And that's how you get the best out of a broader purpose. And that's always a challenge. I think it's doubly a challenge now that some of that move towards a broader purpose is coming from below, is spontaneous.
Thanks, Glenn. And I'm sure, Amanda, you have a few things to say on this. You work with leaders in the area of leadership, and very much embedded in what Jeff and Glenn were saying was people making choices and motivating others. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for inviting that. So my sense is that we really need to be learning from COVID and from what the whole experience of people working remotely, and people are working out how to establish their sense of connection, how much autonomy they want, how much they want to be managed, how much they want to have discretionary capacity in terms of managing their energy, their time, and things like that. We're getting a whole lot of new data about this, and it's telling us that people want to be empowered. They want to have more capacity to contribute when it works for them. They want to be cared for. They want to feel connected in new ways. And I think that this really does tell us that there's a whole new skill set for leaders around paying attention to that. And so again, to go back to my opening remarks, I think thinking about purpose is something that the executive team come up with when they go away for their annual strategic retreat. Like, it's just not going to work. Purpose needs to be this very iterative sort of understanding, where, as Glenn was saying, the values are lived clearly, visibly, in new ways. One of the other important things that I think is coming across loud and clear from this crisis is that people are revaluing health and life as opposed to economics and growth. That's what's coming through. And so, that's an important thing for organizations to be taking into account when they're rebalancing, when they're making some of those trade-offs that both Glenn and Jeff were talking about.
If I could build on that, I agree totally with what Amanda said. It is worth, I guess, complementing that by thinking about what is it uniquely that top management can do to help empower that and drive it forward. And sometimes that is making values concrete and actionable. And so an example that comes to my mind is Paul O'Neill, who was Treasury Secretary under the first President Bush in the US. But before that, he led Alcoa, a giant aluminum smelter. And he brought a laser focus on worker safety, which is unusual in that industry. And he was asked multiple times why. And he had two answers. The first was, it's the right thing to do. This is a dangerous industry and we need to take care of the human beings who we are responsible for. But the second is, it advances our financial performance. And he pointed to things they did, like they tracked safety very closely. And it was part of your performance review and it was part of promotion criteria, formally. If people were getting hurt in your division, you were not moving up and you might be moving out. So one thing that did is it provided visibility into problems with training and safety. Because if equipment is injuring people, something is wrong. And so tracking safety statistics is a great way to observe that. It also meant in an industry that historically has really bad industrial relations, during his leadership, they had some of the best relationships with industry they'd ever had with their workers. What's valuable there is it takes people up top to drive that this is what determines how people get promoted in my organization down. And it shows that you can very legitimately have dual drivers for your purpose. This was first of all about keeping human beings safe, having a sense of responsibility for your employees, which neither rules out or is ruled out by, and it also generates performance advantages. So I think some of the real challenge going forward is going to be capturing that energy and that different sense of values that Amanda has talked about with how do we build that into our processes so it can really be experienced and supported.
And what you're getting into there, Glenn, is a story about employee value proposition. So why does someone choose to work for company A versus company B? And it's interesting how, if you go back into last century, employee value proposition was about keeping someone safe and putting food on the table. But as we've evolved, it's more now about self-actualization. And so particularly in the service industry, professional services, people want to know who you are. There needs to be that values overlap. And for anyone who dismisses this exercise as maybe not particularly meaningful, in terms of attracting the talent, you need to send signals out there about what is important to you. So you put a stake in the ground and say, this is who we are. This is who we are as an organization. Do you want to be a part of this? And so with the self-actualization piece there, so particularly I find our MBA students are really hungry to learn at a very base level about what that organization is about. To what extent is it a shareholder primacy story, or are they a little bit more enlightened in terms of thinking about why the organization exists and therefore why that individual should work for them. I think about so Melbourne Business School. So when I was looking at the options post PhD, there was very clear statements, or there were very clear statements that this school was about society more broadly, and I found that something that really attracted me. When I was working for the Aussie Institute of Sport on this exercise, where they were trying to get at vision and mission, there were a few Brits in the room saying that when we were looking as to where we go next for our next role, they wanted to see what the vision and purpose, or vision and mission of AIS was, and they couldn't find it. And they were saying, well, that would have been the story about who this organisation is, what's it about. So I would say to any executive pondering the importance of this exercise, yep, it's about clarity and it's about providing clear direction to the existing staff, but it's also a talent attraction tool and one that could potentially be very powerful.
Yeah. So can I build on that? If and that whole issue about identities and sort of what people stand for. I mean, I think it's another thing that's coming through very strongly with our crisis experiences. Sometimes what matters, what has impact from leaders is not what they say or do, but who they are, who they're being. And you can get that, you can get that even remotely, very clearly from people. So maybe the words and the deeds, not even as important as that sense of who and how leaders are being. So I think it's, again, there's a real opportunity to do some learning about that about how to encourage leaders to pay attention to that presence and bringing that presence to how they are. And it goes back to that question about how much guidance and how much prescription. I mean, my general feeling is that it's always a good thing when leaders talk less and listen more. and you can demonstrate a lot of power and a lot of impact through the quality of your listening. It's often a temptation, I think, to fill a space up with more prescription than is needed. And it goes back to that tension we were talking about earlier. I think the evidence is that people are crying out, given this experience, for some autonomy, for feeling empowered to make choices for themselves and to manage their workload in the way that works for them. And we need to be paying attention to that as leaders and people interested in leadership.
That raises a really important point. As people do want more autonomy, one of the roles of purpose certainly is to guide what we do, but it's also such a powerful guide to what we don't do, what actions are outside the bounds of how we do things. And I remember having a conversation with a middle manager recently, and he was expressing this frustration. He was very drawn into the strategy process, given his position in the company. But he found it very difficult to get the folks he managed particularly engaged in the details of strategy. They just didn't see it as relevant. And so part of what we talked about in this conversation was the value of the purpose as something you can engage anyone in the firm in. This is who we are as an organization. This is who we hope you will contribute to being and what we hope you will get out of being part of this organization. And here are the bounds that puts on behavior, on choices, even if you don't care about the details of our annual strategy because you don't see it as relevant. So it can be a great tool for responding to that need that Amanda pointed out and that change that we're seeing.
And language you hear in this space is the word over-communicate. So as an executive, what is it you want to over-communicate such that it will guide the daily behaviours, micro choices? Now, we've got to come back, of course, to Amanda's really valid point about, yep, we need to provide guidance from the top, but you've also got to get out of the way at some point and trust that talent to go ahead and do a job, innovate. Particularly during this period, there's a lot more decisions happening decentralised from the top. So you want to make sure that as they go away and make those decisions and you've empowered them to do so, that you've given them some guidance as to what behaviours are acceptable and what aren't, to come back to Glenn's point. But also, what's the end goal here again? You know, why are we actually doing this? And so that repurposing exercise, or making sure that the purpose is fresh and well understood, I just think it's really important right now when, whether we know it or not, there's just a lot more decentralised decision making through a lot of organisations.
And in your, and I'll open this to anyone on the panel, in your dealings with organisations and leaders right now, are you seeing things done differently? Are you seeing conversations around strategy playing out differently? Are you seeing strategies for engagement around purpose being played out differently to how it may have been even 6 months ago?
Well, I can say I've had quite a few clients who want to sit down and have the conversation that they hadn't had before. And particularly because a lot has changed, obviously, in terms of what the potential opportunities are for markets we can play in or markets that are no longer viable. So there's really big decision points for a lot of organisations right now, as in for this next 3 to 6 months, where to play. And some organisations are experiencing incredible growth, so while others obviously aren't. So for the ones that are, you know, so what do we want to really push hard on for the next 6 months and then let go? So all of those really big where to play decisions need to happen under the banner of purpose. So hang on, why are we in this again? What are we doing? In a workshop with City Power Core before, well, just as this all kicked off, my last face-to-face back then, the CEO was literally doing that, putting the purpose on the wall and saying, okay, folks, a lot of decision points. There it is. Safe, reliable, affordable energy. okay, so what are we going to do here?
And can I just come in and say, you know, my sense is that when a leader does that, it needs to be not just the top management team.
Yeah,
It
right.
needs to be a conversation that is being encouraged in all parts of the organisation, because in all parts of the organisation will be happening. You know, it'll be going on remotely and in teams and so on. So I think, again, it's such a reminder for leaders to make sure they're having it. And this goes back to the language question that Glenn was raising, having it in ways that get people excited and help them feel as though they can shape the next 6 months, if not the next few years. I mean, my own sort of sense too is that the best leaders I've seen doing that, they are sort of taking us into their own worlds, you know, and we really are seeing a lot more of people's lounge rooms and their studies and their, you know, their kitchens and their lives and their partners and their kids, which is a marvelous thing. I think potentially, I think it's a really marvelous thing, because it does help us connect more deeply. It helps us care about each other. It helps us understand each other. And I think that does open the way for a much deeper level of discussion and conversation and sharing about these very important matters.
I think so, Amanda. And we have just over 100 people online, and it might be a nice moment to actually check in with you. You'll get a prompt for a poll question in a moment, and we'd love to hear from you how connected you're feeling to your organisation, and has that changed in recent times? So you'll see a pop-up on the screen in a moment, and there are a few responses, whether it's diminished, unchanged or strengthened over the recent weeks or months. We'll see the results pop up on the screen in a moment and share with you our initial reactions to the data that's coming through. All right, there are some results. We're getting diminished at 21%, unchanged at 31%, and strengthened at 48%. Glenn, what's coming up for you as you're looking at that?
Well, that first of all, it's actually really encouraging, and I think it does speak to the opportunity that's here, and that I think companies are having to be more deliberate about their purpose. They are communicating more. You can't do things on autopilot anymore. And when I think about the extremes, the diminished and the strengthened, I think of a comparison between two companies I've worked with. And this is that moment of truth, right? You suddenly have employees who you've said are empowered, who you trust, we hire the best, etc. And now they're working at home. Well, one thing you can do is begin using a lot of monitoring software. Make sure they're working the hours they say they're working, etc. That's one option. The other option is to have your CEO say in an internal video, you're not working at home right now. You're at home during a crisis. And we need you to contribute as you can to the organization. And then share some of the difficulty he was having. You're seeing an extreme. You know, you're seeing a moment of truth, and some companies really living it, and some companies, I think, struggling to maintain what they had said before under really tough times. And I'm not dinging anyone with that, because there are different circumstances and different challenges. But I think we see the extremes because companies are really now up against it, and no one is cruising anymore.
And as a researcher, I'd really like to unpack that strengthened. It'd be really interesting, Amanda, to know how much of that is because of leadership behaviours, or how much is because of the fact that that they've recognised the systemic importance of the industry that they're in.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from some of our participants in some way or another about that. But, that's something that I've been sort of getting anecdotally, just in um, talking to people that, in spite of all the constraints, that they are getting a message that that leadership cares about them, and cares about their well-being. I think that that's often coming through in
Yeah.
quite new ways. I think sometimes what's happened is actually organisational routines have slowed down because of the demands of Zoom and so on. And so I think people are paying quite a lot of attention to each other, and people are feeling like they are cared about. So I think it's a really interesting time, and I just hope that some of the learnings that we've got from this process, will stick as we start to move back into a faster pace. I mean, I'm all for slow through this. I'm slow, and all of the reflection and exchange that's allowing around some of these very, very important questions.
Yeah, and you just think, Amanda, that maybe a lot of leaders have revealed a lot more of themselves, as you were saying before.
Yes.
They've necessarily become more authentic in the way that they've delivered their messages or led the teams.
Yeah, and look, I think I think in the old days we were able often to have a professional identity that was here, and then we had a personal identity that was here, and never the twain shall meet. And we're appearing differently. We're less suited. When we're interacting. We're less surrounded by the trappings of power. And I think that that's a good thing. That enables more vulnerability. It enables more openness. It enables more admission of doubt and worry and emotional connection. And they're all good things, especially if we're talking about these questions.
Yep. And I wonder how much of it is leaders providing a really strong story about what we want to be when we come out the other side of this. So right now, despite that I have a purpose about society or customer, I've got to survive, for instance, and it's a financial imperative. But I've reminded people that, look, we've got to pay the Queen or King their penny in the next quarter so that we can do the stuff that matters when we come out the back end of this. And I find that really interesting right now. You're seeing, I think at least, very good leaders just make it clear that, look, short-term survive, mid-term strengthen, and in that third horizon, we're going to arrive.
Yeah. And look, the other thing that's often gone along with that is the whole process of negotiating with employees about how we're going to survive financially. And the best organisations have done that as an open conversation and negotiation. What can we do? This is, if we're going to continue to be viable. I mean, the higher education sector is a really, really good example. Universities are not going to survive in their old form. They are not going to survive. So, I think there's been some good leadership and some less good leadership in that space about how you ensure viability, for the next little while, and then begin to build on that.
I think another interesting piece that has happened is some of the processes that get in the way or make it difficult for people to act organically on best impulses have come down. It's become a little bit easier. And as an example of this, I actually think back to an example from when I was growing up. I mentioned my mom owned a grocery store in a little farming community. And one evening, one of the buildings in downtown caught on fire. And we went down to the grocery store to start hauling water and sports drinks and stuff down to the firefighters to help support them. They were fighting the fire. And multiple of our employees had driven into the store to do exactly that same thing. Hadn't been asked to. It was just this is the decent thing to do, right? And so we go do it. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. You talked about, Jeff, you talked about the people who are really proud of the contribution they're making to keeping people fed and toilet papered or supported otherwise. I think we're seeing people respond really positive to this type of crisis, and organizations giving them maybe a little bit more room to do that. And I think that helps build that kind of deeper engagement we saw in the poll.
As you were speaking, I started to look at some of the questions in the Q&A, and the first one really links to what you're saying, but asking for some practical, I think, advice around this topic. So I'll read the first question out if you don't mind, and a number of you have upvoted it, so it seems like a pertinent one to talk to at this time. And the question is, what are some practical ways to involve the broader organisation, so say hundreds or thousands of people, in the development of a purpose, and to avoid the exec teams developing it themselves and potentially not getting buy-in? So on a practical, tangible level, how do you get that mass support, that buy-in?
Yeah.
To take that one.
So I've had a client go through this process quite recently. So this is one with retail stores dispersed across the nation. And so they were doing workshops at the level of each retail outlet where they're trying to work out the secret sauce. They're saying to people, what are you proud of about this organisation and what aren't you proud of? And in asking those questions, you learn a lot about what's really important to the employees about this organisation. And what was revealed, for instance, was how they were really proud of the fact that they'd helped the old lady who came in and didn't know anything about a phone. And they'd been really, really good with the refunds, despite the fact that the thing was a bit scuffed. And so they're saying, well, that's what employees are proud of. Okay, so we can put together a story around values, which flows through to purpose. Now, the other practical tip here is once you've got that, you've got to make sure incentives reflect purpose. And we've mentioned this before, but we've got to make sure that the leadership team get it. Now, the other thing that we do here is we just got to check in on a regular basis and call one another out on behaviours that are above or below the line, that are consistent with purpose and values, and that are inconsistent. And so I saw a really good example, a Kiwi lady who was part of the public sector in New Zealand, and that's what she went away and did. So on a monthly basis, there were the conversations about, okay, so what was consistent with purpose and what wasn't, so that people can bring this to life. And what you do, so Melbourne Storm, for instance, they do the scenarios. So scenario A, B, C, given our purpose and values, how should we behave in that moment?
Mm.
Yeah, so can I just build on that? I've seen some great examples like Jeff, where, fantastic, very sort of regular opportunities for people to kind of reflect on the values, reflect on whether they're being lived. It fails if the senior executive team regard that as an organisation development project or a little transformation project off to the side. If they don't own it, if they don't get in those meetings and hear the conflicting and the points of tension. So it has to go both ways. I mean, you can't have a really good process that's out there in the field and engages people and not have real people on the line at the senior level, but also vice versa. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And as you were saying that, Amanda, I was looking at the next question that's in the Q&A list, and I think it actually follows on from what you're talking about. Because Amy's question is around the connection and communication. Amy's asking, how important is face-to-face connection between people in organisations as organisations exit a crisis? And with the trend towards utilising Zoom for meetings longer term, what will organisations be missing out on in terms of cultural change and employee engagement if they fail to strike the balance between virtual and in-person communication?
Mm.
Wow, that's the question, isn't it?
It's been upvoted because I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. Look, if I might just say one thing and hand over to Glenn or Jeff. I was a bit of a Zoom skeptic. I'm a face-to-face person. I love being in the room with people. And I've written a lot on this and I've done a lot of research on it. But I've actually had some really powerful experiences working virtually, especially in the mindfulness space, which really surprised me. Mm-hmm. So I have been surprised at how, with some understanding and how we can establish some real connection virtually. And so that's exciting. I mean, that's exciting for work that we do remotely and, with international teams. And, I'm thinking about a lot of the work in the Indigenous space where we're often, where we have to bring people in from very remote locations. Now, if we can use remote technology much more powerfully, then that's a great bonus. So I think it will be the combination. I'm really looking forward to getting back into a classroom with a group of people.
I think we're learning a lot about this right now, Amanda. We're gathering a lot of data, aren't we? And so many of us have the story that you have, as in we've been really pleasantly surprised by how well it has worked. But that said, I had my first strategy workshop since March last week, and it was a 2-day workshop. And during the workshop, the 3D is helpful to work out who's leaning in, who's not, such that at the coffee break, who's the skeptic, you've got to go and have a yarn to and say, well, tell me more, what's your concern? Those little things are where you could build rapport and nip a problem in the bud. I just worry I miss those opportunities when I haven't got the face-to-face.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think there's some lessons we can draw from companies that have been virtual from the get-go, that really have experienced not so much change in their working patterns. And some of that I think is very specific to the type of mission, the type of employee, the type of challenge. But clearly it can be done. And I think one of the useful things that may have come out of this experience is, I think it was very easy to say, well, yeah, there are companies that can do that, but they're all tech companies, right? That's all its own little different world. And to Amanda's point, I think we're recognizing that a broader set of companies can do more in that space than we thought. At the same time, I think there's an argument to be had for understanding where and when that personal is so important. And there's certainly some research and to Jeff's comment, right? Conflict over Zoom is probably not the best thing to do, right? Conflict, the difficult conversations, there's a lot of value in what happens in the face-to-face. But does that mean that our morning stand-up meeting has to be physical? Probably not. And I hope we're getting a little more flexible and eventually a little more thoughtful about how to distribute our physical and our virtual presence. And it's a learning process we've been forced into.
Thanks for those responses. And there's two conversations going on in a way. There's the internal organizational purpose, communication, there's the internal conversation, and then there's this large macro conversation with all that's going on around us. And Ben's question really takes us to that direction again. Ben asks, any observations on competitors interacting differently with each other, for example, supermarkets and banks? So to sort of zoom out again, what are your thoughts in response to that question?
So one of the fascinating examples that we're seeing at the moment is the cooperation among pharmaceutical and medical research bodies that are normally highly competitive for granting, for getting grants and getting funding support, having them come together in a collaborative way. You think, wow, what could the world achieve if we did that across some key industries like this? So it's just so exciting to think about that possibility.
Yeah, and obviously you need to tread carefully here because of anti-competitive issues. But you've seen some level of collaboration, say in the supermarket organisation, the supermarket industry, where they've tried to work out best ways to sort out their supply chains. So on that side of the vertical, it's a bit safer to collaborate, or a lot safer to collaborate. But I think where you are seeing collaboration is as we all work through these really big questions of to what extent does virtual meetings with customers work? To what extent is online delivery of a service, whether it be teaching or whether it be a workout, how does that all work? So I think everyone's learning together in terms of how far to push digital, whether it be in terms of internal process or how we interact with a customer. And that's not happening necessarily through formal exchange mechanisms, but everyone's watching very closely to see who's trying what is working, because right now there's just a lot of experimentation, a lot of prototyping going on. In the education space, there's a lot of trial and error going on right now to see what works and what doesn't. So with leadership development, strategy workshops, whatever it is. So everyone's looking over their shoulder at the competitor to see what are they trying? Did it work? Didn't it? Because we're all trying to really rapidly prototype to get to stuff that will be effectively delivered to a client who's happy.
And I think there's a really interesting allegory we can draw to some of the cooperative behavior we've seen in the sustainability space, where I think a couple of things happen. One, companies often view that as less directly competitive. It has competitive implications if done well, but they see the opportunity to share knowledge, to improve practice across industry, to learn from each other in that way. And so you do see some cooperative behavior that way. And then sometimes there are specific goals that many companies might share. Oftentimes we're looking for policy certainty. And you'll see companies that are putatively competitors come together to government or work with. I've done some work crossing the for-purpose government and for-profit sectors in international development. And there it's often you can find the part you agree on and collaborate on that to tremendous effect. And I think COVID has helped sharpen that understanding. And to Jeff's point, you do have to be thoughtful about where you do that. You do want to preserve competitive advantage, not get yourself in regulatory trouble. But with some creativity, there are a lot of places where many competitors would jointly benefit. Often society would also, with a certain degree of cooperation. And we've had some nice models of that.
Thanks, Glenn. And your comments link so nicely to Christy's question, which is a big one that ties it all together in some ways. Christy's asked, and I've just lost the question. I might go to the next question. I'll try to find it.
Sorry, I saw that, Aviva.
Yeah.
Might have because I just typed an answer to Christy.
Oh, okay. There we go. Did you want to talk to the question in your answer, Jeff?
Yeah. So Christy was asking a question about how do you use purpose to engage community and demonstrate that you are credibly a good local citizen. And the response I gave there was, you've just got to make sure that if you put that purpose statement in front of a local community leader or a politician or someone who is an important stakeholder in your world, you put it down at the same time as you put an action plan that reflects that behaviour or that purported purpose or set of values. And so what you're trying to do there is just make it clear to them that, look, this just isn't about words. The other key point there is, so we've just got to make sure that when you put a strategy down in front of them, and I've seen this happen in the port space, for instance, where you put that down in front of the local mayor or shire president and say, look, our port employs everyone in this town. And we recognise that community outcomes are really key to us being a successful organisation, to our organisational health. And so you put that purpose and strategy on a page in front of the local politician or community leader, and you say, and you know what, success of this organisation is dependent on me meeting these KPIs. In that case, it might be zero environmental spills, zero noise issues, or whatever it is. So you've got to make sure that they see that your 5 measures of success of this organisation, of those 5, 1 or 2 of them clearly relate to community outcomes. And then you're starting to build a more credible story about, and this isn't just about me trying to appease you or shut you up.
Fantastic. Thank you. What I might invite is one final poll as we start to wrap up this conversation. I'm quite curious, and I know my fellow panelists are quite curious to know how values and purpose are guiding the way your organisation is operating right now. So as we close, to offer a final piece of data to take away from this, you'll get a poll question in a moment to ask how your organisation is being guided by values and purpose as it's operating right now through and post this crisis. And as I'm reading that question, I'm quite aware that for many organisations, it's to this crisis, but it's also beyond this crisis. So you can keep those things in mind as you're responding to this. So 50% say yes, 13% say no, and 37% say somewhat. So closing remark, what's that data saying to each of you? Maybe if we'll start with you, Glenn.
So I'm trying to remember what we got when we did this question a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it was close to 70% actually.
Who said yes? So we're seeing a decline in yeses.
Mm.
That's interesting. I think there is, and this is something that came up in discussions within MBS. There are multiple phases of dealing with this. And we may be in that regression stage where, you know, the rescue stage, everyone has adrenaline and kicks in and extra effort. And then you reach this regression stage where it just becomes very hard, very tired. We've been asking a lot of each other and of ourselves. And this may reflect just some of that fatigue, including purpose fatigue.
Thanks, Glenn. Jeff, Amanda, final comments?
So I think it's mixed. I mean, the research is that in crisis, leaders tend to centralise, they tend to micromanage, they tend to draw things in, they tend to stop going out and asking and seeking information. And so that might reflect a little bit of that. But I think 50%, you know, I mean, I think it reinforces what we've been saying throughout this webinar, that this represents opportunity. It represents an opportunity for leaders to go back, to repurpose, to refresh, to be open to how their employees, their stakeholders want them to go forward.
Thanks, Amanda. And final comment from you, Jeff?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to ask those who have answered yes there. So what is that? What is the statement of purpose within your organisation, or what is the one that seems to be lived if it isn't explicit? How does that guide behaviours? Does it give you a clear sense of stakeholder prioritisation? Can you give me examples of behaviours and choices that reflect that? And when I do that exercise with groups of executives, the number usually goes from somewhere between 50 and 70 to somewhere between 10 and 20. And so my observation is that it's generally not that well done. And why is that a problem? Well, if we don't have that North Star as an organisation, there's a risk that people are going in different directions. And just back to Amanda's point of just getting that mix right between top down, bottom up, you know, that you empower, but you provide guidance and some level of guidance. And to provide that guidance, the question is, what do you want to over communicate? And my answer is purpose and values.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Looking at the clock, we're just on time, and there's so much more to say on this topic and beyond. And thank you for your questions. While we haven't gotten around to all of those questions, this is a series and it gives us real strong indications of the sorts of questions you'd like us to keep talking about in this ongoing series. As we close up, I'd like to sort of reiterate that you will get us a link to a survey at the end of this session, and that's another opportunity for you to share with us any feedback so we can keep making these webinars relevant and meaningful for you, and let us know what topics you'd like to hear some more on. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is part of a two-part series on how organisations can survive now and thrive later. And while today we were focusing very much on business and strategy through the lens of purpose and what the implications for leadership and people, next week on Thursday we'll be talking on the same topic but with the reverse focus, where as a priority we'll be thinking about people matters and leadership, and then how does purpose and strategy fit into that. and you'll be seeing Jeff again next week with a number of other of my colleagues. There is also coming up on Thursday, the 25th of June, the next part of our virtual Talking Data series. And this time we'll be joined by Professor Steve Tadelis from UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. So please join us for that as well. It was lovely to see you all. Thank you. We had over 100 people join us today. Fantastic to get your comments, to see your information come through the polls, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.